Well, I'll try and do a few bits and pieces. So Horizon was a research institute established in 2009, and we took as our mission the opportunities and challenges in the use of personal data. So there are many folks out there who are very strong privacy advocates who, and I know some extreme privacy advocates who say, don't record the data and therefore it can't be misused. And we're sort of trying to take a middle path. We're trying to understand how much richer data in the future can be used in an ethical and morally useful way. When we set off in 2009, I predicted that the European Union General Data Protection Regulation was going to happen pretty much in the way it has happened, because while it's one of the most lobbied for and against pieces of legislation ever, not very much has changed in the last 8 years. So we took that as read. I mean, we're supposed to be doing research for the future, so looking at the current legal framework and saying, right, let's build all our tech for the current legal framework is not really planning for the future and doing research. So we started off with a pretty strong line on this. So I'm not a lawyer, right? However, I had to at least become familiar enough to understand what's going on. When I was first approached to give this talk, I was asked, could you talk about who owns data? And my immediate knee-jerk response to this, having been beaten into by lawyers, is no one owns data. It's a non-concept. There is no property right in data at law. So in law, data may come with obligations and limitations. So copyright material, the representation of copyright work, there are restrictions on copying that. Personal data, there are obligations, and that's what the data protection regulation deals with, in terms of what you're allowed to do with the data and how you have to interact with the person whose data that is. But there are all sorts of other limitations. Plans for bombs and other less savory materials. There's legislation about what you can and cannot do with certain types of images, whether they're cartoons or real. So ownership, the question always arises, well, why do people talk about ownership? Why is that phrase used? And I like the work by Kieran O'Hara, who did this work on 7 Veils of Privacy, papers referenced there. And it's really just to do with the way in which we express things about not so much ownership, but being invested in it, and it's, as he says, the compulsion to use possessive adjectives. My house. I may or may not own my house. If you rent a house, you'll still call it my house. So it's something else going on there. So my appeal here, the first appeal is, be very careful in discussing data when people say, well, this is my data, or it should be the patient's data or someone else's data. It's like you're not having the right level of discussion. And by the time you've built systems and you've talked about all that and you talk to lawyers, they say, well, your concepts of data are completely wrong. So that's one thing. I'm not going to go into this in detail. Yes, there are rights to collections of data, the database right, and for many of you, that will be an important right. But for now, we're just going to concern ourselves with what's happening with personal data, because this is where I come from, and it's also, in terms of my interactions with now the folks in MindTech, it's also where we're starting to look at how can we use extremely personal data that could be collected by technology. What is the appropriate way to go about trying to use that data? While not only dealing with this legal situation, but I would actually say taking an even more extreme ethical position. But the other thing is, in fact, we have to also have regard for other specific regulations. Data protection is also often held up as the one that's the bogeyman. But if you dare to hold financial information, you are going to have to simultaneously comply with all financial regulations, which includes money laundering detection and fraud and criminal activity. So if you collect data from someone, you're bringing with it a large number of regulatory issues, not just data protection. So why am I interested in this? Well, it is this is the issue on the right here, right? Before we go and build something, could we please ask the question is, why on earth are we building this? And it surely should be more than simply profit. And in particular, when it's going to have a significant impact on society, and certainly some of the comments that, not surprising really, given Elvira's work for me for the last few years, her comments about is the digital driving us rather than society pushing back and saying what we want from the digital. So I'm going to start with a very simple question. How much stuff can we actually do in terms, very generally in any application area, but let's look in terms of whether it's research into mental health or treatments or managing conditions. How's about we try to figure out what we could do without sharing any data with anyone? Okay? And the reason to do this is that most people's faith in sharing data is pretty low, and every year it gets worse. And the reason every year it gets worse is every year there's another goddamn breach. And the data is getting more and more sensitive, and people are going, hang on, what's going on here? Every year they run these surveys. This is from a few years ago. It's a couple of % lower. Everyone's going, I don't trust this, I don't trust this. And often it will be said, and this is the one that gets my goat up, well, the next generation, the kids don't care. If anyone dares to say that to me, I want to see your published research on that, as opposed to your anecdotal evidence from one observation of something you saw that was a kid did that was slightly stupid. This is precisely what we've been on with CASMA and on bias within our projects within Horizon for the last 3.5 years, and indeed contributed to a report that just came out yesterday on what we should do about children on the internet. The kids have actually got a pretty nuanced understanding of a lot of this stuff, a lot more than most people give them credit for. So the problem is we're getting erosion in a lot of these digital technologies, and I believe the person who might be responsible for Mental Snap and involved in that organization might be here today, at which point I can tell you that I downloaded your app, I installed it, and I will not use it. Your terms and conditions do not give me the assurance. You've built it in a particular way that I disagree with. You've got copies of personal data you do not need. Please come and talk to me, okay? I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think we can build it correctly. So I'm going to talk about that now. So the way of big data. Huge numbers of systems are built this way. It's the native way in which most apps are built. We start off with something small and personal. We aggregate the data, and then we analyze it. And hopefully we then give some service back to somebody. That's one way of doing it. How's about trying it the other way around? How's about we try to analyze the data first and ask the question, in order to answer that, whatever the statistic is you want from the large data, from the big data, ask the question, what is the sufficient statistic or the minimally sufficient statistic you need from each individual to answer that question? And in fact, a lot of the times, and a lot of things I look at, actually, there isn't actually a statistic you're answering from the big data set, because the calculation is done completely independently on every individual. I'll give you an example. I am an Experian Mosaic B06, Bank of Mum and Dad. It's not very hard to figure that out if you look at me and realize I've got a 19 or 21-year-old kid. I'm looking forward to being a B8. Okay? Now, the calculation of that by Experian on me is a calculation they do independently of every other person they do credit checking for. There is no shared statistic here. The calculation done to know what I am in terms of my demographic classification is done independently of everyone else. Ask yourself the question, how far can you process someone's data to get to the point where you have a minimum statistic? Even if you do have a global statistic to be calculated, what's the minimum? So let's take an example. I'll take one from Michelle's space. Let's say we have video cameras in the house, and they're looking at all my movements. They're doing gait detection, activity detection, and they're trying to determine whether I've changed my activity patterns, my attitude, my mood, how I'm walking, all of this stuff. What you want out of that system is the statistics, a statistical model of, is this person still behaving in the normal way, or are they starting to perhaps show some signs of anxiety or something else? What you don't want to get out of that is streaming video. And the idea that we're going to put video cameras in people's homes and do activity detection in elderly people's home to look after them or anything else, and we're going to stream this video across the internet, just like Alexa and Siri do today. I mean, it's madness. People will be wandering around naked in their homes. You don't hear that, but you do see it. So the fact is, either we solve the problem of processing all of this data in a privacy-preserving way and understand what these minimum statistics are that we actually want out of the personal data, or we give up on a lot of those opportunities and just say, or else, of course, what will happen is, commercially, people won't give up. They will try and deploy, and they have done, insecure video cameras into children's bedrooms. It's a reality. It's happened. We need to fix that. If we actually want to get serious about it and not just have some foolish people who have more money than sense buying insecure video cameras, putting them in their children's bedrooms, and hence creating a felon-o-matic, that image, an image of a naked child under 16 going across the internet, is probably illegal. You, by putting the camera in your house, have committed a criminal offense. So we really can't start deploying that by the NHS in order to do therapies in people's homes. We've got to do something else. So it comes back to this issue. How much computation of all of this data that we want to use can we perform in private? And I don't mean private in the way that privacy policies are written. Privacy policies on websites say, this is how we are going to abuse your privacy. We're going to take your data and we're going to give it to these other people. And that's what we'll call privacy policy. Private, to me, private, and most people's understanding would be, and it's not even confidentiality, it's not a matter of sharing with someone else. Often when people say private, they mean secret, not shared with anyone else. In my house, I go to the bathroom and I lock the door. Okay, that's privacy that we live with every day. Now, everyone knows what I'm doing in the toilet. I sleep with my wife, but even within the house, we have privacy. And it's an interesting experience, when children grow up, at what point do they start locking the door? And you respect their privacy. These are things that are done unobserved. So we need to start thinking about, this technology is great, but if we do not start thinking in a much more nuanced sense about how we do privacy, and I mean real privacy. So the reason I give the Experian Mosaic example is that that's an example where the derived statistic, my demographic classification, I do not view as very sensitive personal information, because it's pretty obvious. If you went online, looked me up, you'll find enough information to get an estimate of my age. I'm an academic professor. It's like, you'd know what classification I am, okay? But what I won't do is just hand over to anyone who asks for it, all my financial transactions so they can calculate it. So this leads us to here's just one thing I want to say. GDPR, if any of you have data sets and you have not addressed the problem of data portability, you're in this space over here. So I'm going to come to each of you next May and say, I would like my data in the standardized format that I can take to someone else online for free. No more £10 for a subject access request. May next year I can do this. How many of you are ready? Most academics are not. But one of the things that opens up is, May next year I can turn up and say, please give me the data. And that means that all of these characters, the people who create, that capture data about us or that we generate, or IoT devices around it, if it's personal data, I can turn up and say, give me that data. So in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, give me that data, and I'm going to put it in a thing that we have called the Databox. This is my data. The key thing about data protection regulation and most other regulations is that processing my own data doesn't come with any compliance issues. It comes with some, but it ditches most of them. I can take any of my data and process it. Now, of course, I can't write, well, maybe I could, but not anymore, I'm too old, but I can't write all the applications I might want, but cunning people could write the applications. So in our Databox world, we think about a system where we can accumulate the user's data, some of it directly from Internet of Things devices or cameras in your home or whatever else, and others which we fetch online, pull it all together, and a third party who wants to provide me with some service, for example, an app to help me manage my mental health condition, can process this data, and I may or may not permit them to take away some statistics, or I may just pay them £5 for the privilege of the software. You remember that model, the model where someone shipped you software, you paid for it, you ran it on your own computer in the privacy of your own home, and only you saw the answers. It's called the 1990s Microsoft business model. But we have lost the plot on this. We truly have lost the plot, where everyone thinks the only way to get value and the only way to build apps is to share data. And in doing that, we are creating our own limitations. So the Databox is an ecosystem. I won't go into the details on this because I've had the 1-minute warning already. It is a physical object in your house that can be the processing platform for your data. There are many detailed reasons why it's a physical platform in your house, which we won't go into now. There's lots of technology behind this, unbelievable amounts of complex technology. The important thing is that it has audit logs of everything every app does. So apps are required to declare what data they will process and how they'll process it. They get verified before they get put in the App Store, and then they get monitored when they're running to make sure they don't go rogue. There's a whole bunch of people involved in that project. So my appeal here, in conclusion, is think about the minimum sufficient statistics you need from each participant. That means you might write an app for each new experiment. Okay? Don't think of the user as an entry in a database. Think about what it is that I want to calculate on that user's data. Send that software to the user, let them compute the result and send you the result back. And sometimes, if it's just simply it's feedback to the user, you don't need to see anything from that. But probably for research, you at least want to understand something about it. Embrace this sort of approach in your existing approaches, where you have large databases of centralized databases. But think about one of the research questions you could ask if you had 100 participants who had all their social media data, all of their activity data in their home, as well as GP records and what their other medical records. You're not going to get them to donate all of their personal data, including all those videos in their homes, into a research project. And in fact, we've come across projects that ethically, our ethics committee have not permitted us to do because the data that we would need to record, we couldn't see it. So this is a mechanism to actually do research on data your ethics committees won't let you see. And the other one is that by pushing this style of operating, there's a question. Will the users believe us when we say we're not stealing their data? How will we go about building that trust with them, because their trust has been undermined by most of the activities of the commercial providers to date? But if we can solve that problem, we could actually start getting a lot more participation from a much wider audience who are currently today extremely skeptical, because to me, of the business practices and the technical practices of how we've built many of our modern systems. Thank you.